Where dips the rocky highland of Sleuthwood in the lake, there lies a leafy island where flapping herons wake. The drowsy water rats, there we've hid our fairy vats, full of berries and of the reddest stolen cherries. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. That is the first stanza of The Stolen Child by W.B. Yeats. In it, fairies tempt a human child to come away with them to fairyland, and in the end, he goes. So today, we're going to be talking about fairies! Fairies and fairy tales can still teach us a valuable lesson, even as adults. Today, I will first discuss how fairies are still relevant in our culture. We will cover the origins of fairy folklore and dramatization. And finally, I'll show you how fairy tales and fairy myths can still pertain to learning how to acquire a moral character, even as adults. So let's step into the world of the fair folk. Everyone is acquainted with the idea of fairies. The term fairy actually encompasses a wide set of folklore. Richard Shepshus defined the term in the Salem Press Encyclopedia as a mythical, supernatural being or spirit of nature found in the folklore of many cultures. Fairies are usually human-like in appearance and are often depicted as having magical powers. The modern concept of fairies as tiny, benevolent, winged females evolved from the legends of the British Isles, but its roots go back at least to the Roman Empire. While the term fairy itself is particular to traditionally English folklore, it has come to be an umbrella term for many comparable folklore studies. Some notable mentions include the Peri from Persia, the Chinese Hulijing, and the Shonquis from southeast Mexico. We are raised on certain stories of fairies. Disney has popularized fairies by making Tinkerbell and fairy godmothers a staple in the movies and shows they deliver to their audience. They typically are feminine and reward those who are kind or lead people to their fates. Shows like The Fairly Odd Parents and The Winx Club are other examples that are a little bit less Disney. And the Tooth Fairy is a common story we all tell our kids, right? Where a little fairy comes in the middle of the night to collect the baby teeth that they lose and replace them with gifts of some kind. In A Midsummer Night's Dream by William Shakespeare, arguably one of the most famous stories of fairy period, Shakespeare weaves a tale about mischievous but ultimately well-meaning fairies whose tampering in the love affairs of the humans leads to confusion and dueling, but eventually everything is set right. Belief in fairies was taken seriously as recently ago as the early 1900s. In 1917, two young girls in Cottingley, England, took a series of photographs that became rather infamous. There were 5 pictures in total, each depicting the girls and their encounters with fairies. These pictures proved to be so convincing that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle authenticated them. The author of Sherlock Holmes and a spiritualist published articles to which he hoped to convince more people and eventually built the foundation of his book, The Coming of the Fairies. The girls later admitted to it all being a hoax in 1983. They used cardboard cutouts originally of illustrations of fairies from a children's book. Now that we've discussed fairies in the modern age, let's take a look at their more classical origins. Fairies were originally seen as fantastical and fearsome beings. Fairies have a long and varied history. The word fairy was derived from the Old French fairy in the Middle Ages and originated from the Latin fata, referring to one of the fates of Roman mythology. The fates were 3 goddesses said to shape human destiny. In other tellings, they originated by having been demons that neither sided with heaven nor hell in the war between them and ended up in the in-between as punishment. In the article, Away with Fairies by Abigail Sparks, she writes, where medieval fairies were mischievous, lovable, and occasionally unpredictable, the fairies of the 16th century were far more dangerous creatures. Around this time was when fairies started to be seen as more than just mischievous troublemakers, and more so akin to demons. A Midsummer Night's Dream was written in 1595, around the time when fairies' images were being seen with more fear than fancy, and Shakespeare accounted for this by having Puck and Oberon, 2 of the fairy characters in the play, have a dialogue in which Oberon mentions that they are not ghosts or damned spirits and often consort in the daylight. It would appear that what necessitated this scene was not the aesthetic or the structural demands of the play itself, but the audience's default interpretation of fairies as agents of evil, which was at odds with the performance and required some kind of reconciliation with what was going on stage. And then there were branches to fairy culture. There was the Seelie court, who were thought of as lighter, kinder, and more tolerant in their retributions when compared to the Unseelie court, of which needed no provocation to deal out darker forms of punishment at all. William Butler Yeats, the man who wrote The Stolen Child that I read from in the beginning, then further divided them into the trooping fairies and solitary fairies. Trooping fairies were fairies that moved around in large processions, and solitary fairies are rather self-explanatory. One of these fairy troops, or raids, was classically known as the Wild Hunt. Many legends surround them, some saying they're led by Odin or other well-known fairy spirits, but whether they were leading the dead or wildly pursuing something or someone, most men fled inside at the prospect. During this time, it was claimed that for the most part, if people followed a set of rules, they could be relatively safe from the fairies. First rule was that politeness was required. Any slight insult would be met with rancor. Second is never accept fairy food or drink, and don't ever step into fairy circles. And the third is fairies only speak the truth, but often use the truth to confound and twist meaning. There were plenty of other fairy rules as well, but those seem to be the most agreed upon. And most of these rules seem actually pretty familiar, right? I mean, be polite, don't accept food or invitations from strangers. Isn't it rather interesting how they stuck around to these modern interpretations, even if it seems like common knowledge these days? So now that we've covered a brief history of the fairies, let's look at how we might add to our moral resumes from them. I know at this point, you guys are probably wondering how I'm going to bring this little lesson back to the original assignment. In all honesty, I originally wondered that too. But in the myths and folklore were stories, fairy tales, if you will, that were used themselves to teach moral lessons. A pretty common story is the shoemaker's elves. In it, the poor shoemaker and his wife give away their last pair of shoes to a poor widow and only have enough leather to make one more set. In the morning, they awake to the new set of shoes made so beautifully that they sold them for enough money to buy supplies for 2 more pairs of shoes. They continue on this path until the shoemaker stays up one night and finds the elves making the shoes. Him and his wife proceed to make clothes for the elves for helping them. In some versions, the clothes free the elves and they leave, and in others, the clothes offend the elves and they still end up leaving. Either way, in the story, the shoemaker performs an act of kindness solely to help someone else in need, and the elves reward him because of it. Another example is the Brothers Grimm story called Star Money. A little girl who has very few things to her name gives them all away to people who need them more, even down to the clothes on her back. A fairy in the woods sees this and gives her new, beautiful clothes, and stars fall into the earth, which become gold pieces. Once again, someone's complete generosity and kindness is rewarded in the end. These and other fairy tales are told to this day to teach moral and ethical lessons to children, yet they still hold a certain appeal for many adults as well. They provide forms of expression to shed light not only on our own lives, but on the lives beyond our own. And contrary to the impression that fairy tales always end happily ever after, this is not the case. Therein lies much of their power. They helped our ancestors make sense of the unpredictability or randomness of life. They repeated familiar experiences of unfairness, misfortune, bad luck, and ill treatment, and sometimes showed us how to have courage, determination, and ingenuity could be employed even by the most disempowered to change the course of events. Lastly, I think a fairy known as the Banshee exemplifies one of the accomplishments that people with a strong inner light have done. Banshees are imagined to be wailing women. Their shriek is supposed to herald the death of a family member and are often thought of to curse them with that death. Yet, through all the stories I looked through, banshees did no harm, merely wailed in the night to warn the family of a death to come. Isn't that sort of a fantastical twist on the idea of finding a calling? Literally, these banshees are in the middle of the night giving a family a warning that their death one is about to leave, and so the family gets a chance to say goodbye. Anyway, there are plenty of things that we can still take away from fairy tales and fairy folklore even as adults. First, we discussed how fairies are still relevant in our culture. Then we covered the origins of fairy folklore and dramatization. And finally, I showed how fairy tales and fairy myths can pertain to learning how to acquire moral character even as an adult. Now, anytime you see Tinkerbell, you can remember the role of fairies in our past, present, and moral growth and upbringings. Thank you so much.